Do you think of yourself as living in like a divine, theodrama or like a story? Like, do you, are you one of God's characters in his story?
I'm working on it.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. I always think about how I can improve that introduction. It's not the best introduction. Maybe I should add, so that you can have wisdom for life or something. But it's not really the truth. I just love thinking about this stuff. And if you like thinking about it, then you're going to like this show too. This episode is another really fantastic one. I'm really excited to get into it. I have with me Dr. Kenny Pearce, and we're going to be talking about primary causation, grounding, foundational grounding, arguments for God's existence, why theism makes more sense or better sense or is a better explanation of reality than naturalism. It's going to be wild. I'm really excited about it. We're going to be talking about authorial analogies. If you know me at all, you know that I love thinking of God as the author of creation. Before we jump in, though, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon. If you guys like this podcast, you want to see me stick around, you want to see me continue having authors and thinkers and philosophers and business people on, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can support this podcast for as little as $3 a month and as much as $100 a month. We've got some things in the works, working on becoming a 501c3. So there's some tax write-off benefits too. But I appreciate everyone for making this podcast happen. You can find a link to in the description to my Patreon. You can also support this podcast by buying some merch. You can find that in the store tab on YouTube. You can buy shirts like this. Boom, with my ugly mug on it. You can support the work of Chasen Han, who's been making a lot of graphics for me, or Jordan Singer, who made this classic Parker's Pensées logo. And there's a bunch of ways to find me: Twitter, Facebook, Parker's Pensées, Facebook group, Discord. You can find all the links in the description, all that good stuff. But let's get into it. Let's start thinking about some cool stuff here. So again, I have with me Kenny Pearce, and we're going to be talking about primary causation, what that means, grounding, God, and thinking of God as an author of the world. So here we go. Dr. Pearce, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is a really cool paper, and I have to give a shout out to Johnny Waldrop. He sent this to me and told me how much I'd like it, and he was right. This is fantastic. But Dr. Pearce, before we jump in on primary causation and foundational grounding, I want to get a little bit about yourself. How'd you get into philosophy in the first place?
Sure. So there's kind of two streams in terms of what happened to me when I was young here. And both of these stories are ones you'll find fairly common among people who end up being philosophy professors. One is that I had a lot of religious questions that nobody seemed to be able to answer.
Yeah.
And after a while, I figured out that it wasn't just that nobody in my little church in my small town could answer them, right? That kind of nobody could answer them. And there's a lot kind of more thinking to be done, and a lot of interesting things have been said about them through the ages, but never kind of an ultimate indisputable resolution, right?
Yeah.
And so I got really interested in that sort of thing. The second kind of stream was just that I read a lot of science fiction as a kid.
Nice.
And so there was a lot of what if questions, and just all of those things that get to stimulating your mind, right? And so I started finding that there were people who put a lot of effort into addressing these questions really seriously, in fascinating ways. So I went off to college. I was thinking that computer science sounded like a career and philosophy sounded like a hobby.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the plan that I pursued. But as time went on, it started to become clear that somebody might actually pay me to do philosophy all day. And that sounded neat.
That's awesome. The sci-fi got me. Did you have a particular like a favorite author, sci-fi author?
Yes, my favorite author that I'm always promoting is Theodore Sturgeon.
Oh, okay. My dad always tells me about Sturgeon.
Okay. Yeah, not a lot of people have heard of him, but let me give you the short version of why he's so important in the history of science fiction.
Yeah.
Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut both listed him among their biggest influences.
Okay.
he invented Star Trek's Prime Directive and
Okay.
also the Ponfar, which is the like Vulcan mating ritual. He wrote the story with the first green swamp monster that was the inspiration for Swamp Thing.
Wow.
That story is called It with an exclamation point from the
Okay.
1940s. It's a fantastic story, a little bit of kind of horror fantasy, you know. But yeah, so, and he also, his novel More Than Human is one of the first hive mind stories.
Oh, sweet.
And David Crosby from The Birds and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young said that the concept of blesh, which is how the people come together to form the hive mind, was how these early like psychedelic rock bands thought of their
Oh, wow.
relationship within the band. So these are my kind of outside philosophy hobbies, right?
Yeah.
So thanks for letting me geek out on that for a little
No,
bit.
that's awesome.
Before we
My
get down
my
to business.
my dad's obsessed with sci-fi. He's an author in his own right, but he always made me read this stuff growing up, and I got hooked by Philip K. Dick. So I
Oh
know
yeah,
it's kind of like there's so many dick heads out there, right? But I can't help it. He's so good. Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Well, so I don't know if there's a good transition there, talking about God as the author or something like that. You have this paper, Foundational Grounding and the Argument from Contingency, back in like 2016, but you said you've been developing these ideas further. Didn't I think that paper won some kind of award, right?
Yeah, so in 2016, it won the Sanders Prize for the best essay in philosophy of religion, and
That's
then it
awesome.
was published in the 2017 edition of Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Religion. And I might just mention this book
Yep.
because my new book here just published a few months ago. This is a debate with Graham Oppy.
Yeah.
I do present the same argument kind of again in the book in a way that's
Oh.
more designed for beginners.
Oh man, I had
Whereas
no idea that there was. That's awesome. And so it's against Oppie, and so I'm assuming Oppie responded to that in the book then.
yeah,
Awesome.
yeah. So I would really recommend that you check out this book because you'll
Yeah.
find there the 2017 paper, which you can find open access online, is a presentation of the argument, that's kind of meant to be read by other philosophy professors and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. But here in this debate book, there's a presentation of the same argument that's meant for beginning students, and that also includes a response from Graham Oppy, who's one of the top atheist philosophers today.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is that, I think did Dustin Crummett edit that? Is he
Yeah,
okay, and then you and Appy are speaking, or have you already on his YouTube channel?
we will be. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so I don't know if that'll be out by this time or not, but, listeners, go check that out too. Dustin's got a channel. I'll link that in the description. That'll be awesome. I love it. I'm pumped for it. Well, so the paper's broken down into like three parts. The first one, you say that in order for the argument from contingency to succeed, the explanation of history in terms of God must not be a causal explanation. So we need God. Contingency is supposed to get us God, but God can't be the cause of history. Two, God is the foundational ground of history. And then part three, the explanatory advantages of the hypothesis of God being the ground of history. That can't be had within the confines of naturalism. So I thought maybe we could start out by just if someone's totally lost already, thinking about the argument from contingency, and maybe can you distinguish that for us? How is that different than like Kalam cosmological arguments?
Sure. So it's sometimes called the Kalam or first cause argument. Um, that argument says something like everything that begins to exist has a cause, but
Hmm.
the universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. Um, in contrast to this, the argument from contingency is usually framed in terms of explanations rather than causes. Cause and explanation are closely linked concepts, so sometimes we end up talking about causes along the way, but you start out with explanation. You say the kind of the physical universe or all this stuff here, it's contingent, meaning it didn't have to exist.
Hmm.
There didn't have to be a physical universe. Certainly, there didn't have to be this exact physical universe with this exact history. And so, why is the universe as it is? And the argument from contingency wants to kind of say that we need some explanation outside the universe that's going to be the ultimate explanation of why the universe exists. Now, kind of the backstory to this paper is that I kind of, in terms of what I wrote my PhD on, and in terms of what I did, kind of most of my earlier work on, I'm primarily a historian of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about historical figures like Leibniz, like Thomas Aquinas, Samuel Clarke, who pushed this argument from contingency.
Yeah.
And something that's interesting is that all of them say one of the advantages of this argument from contingency is that you don't have to prove that the universe has a beginning in time in order to use this argument.
Yeah.
So the Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides and then Thomas Aquinas, they both say, we know from the Bible that the universe has a beginning in time, but we can't actually prove that by reason to an atheist who doesn't believe in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so we need an argument that doesn't depend on that premise,
Mm-hmm.
because the atheist won't accept it, and we don't have any rational way of making them accept it. And that's why the Kalam argument doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, and then Leibniz and Clarke later, they say the same thing, that even if the universe goes back forever, still we can infer the existence of God by the argument from contingency.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at people pushing the argument from contingency today, like Timothy O'Connor, for instance, they often still end up talking about a cause of the origination of the universe.
Mm.
And so then, not whether their argument works or not,
right,
doesn't have the advantage that the classical proponents of the argument from contingency said that it had.
Yeah.
And then it kind of gets into this mess about how are we to understand, in kind of contemporary Big Bang cosmology, how are we to understand the finite age of the universe? Is there more to physical reality than our universe that started with our Big Bang? Is there really kind of a first moment, and does that matter to the argument?
Yeah.
All this stuff, really interesting, complicated stuff.
Big time.
Like
yeah.
physics and philosophy of physics, right?
Yeah.
But the Kalam argument or first cause argument gets deep into the weeds of that, and I kind of suspect that it might actually be undermined when you look closely enough at the physics there.
Okay.
But the argument from contingency isn't supposed to depend on any of that.
Yeah.
Right? It's supposed to ask this question, as Derek Parfit put it in the title of an essay, why anything, why this? Right?
So good.
Is the question it starts with. And we're supposed to be able to kind of infer let's say a non-naturalistic explanation of the natural world, standing outside the natural world, by asking and answering that question.
Yeah. So I love to think of like the Kalam is like, the start to the race. Like why, it had to have a start, and contingency arguments are like, well, whatever, man. Maybe it's an infinite race. Maybe it's always been, but why? What's holding up the track? Why is why is this grounded at all? Like, yeah, sure, you could trace it back. I don't care. Trace it back as far as back as you want, or keep going. But there's something undergirding this whole race going on. Does that sound like? I mean, it's super simplistic, right? But yeah, I love that.
Yeah, well, and I love the example that Leibniz gives when he talks about this. I just love, because so Leibniz talks about the book Euclid's Elements of Geometry, which was something like would still have been used as a textbook when Leibniz was learning geometry as a child, and Leibniz, of course, is co-discoverer of calculus, so he's big into geometry, right?
Yeah,
it's an important book for him, and it would have been 2,000 years old when he was using it, and so his copy would have been copied from a previous copy, from a previous copy, from a previous copy, long before the invention of printing, back to Euclid. And Leibniz says, imagine that Euclid didn't really write the book either. Imagine that Euclid copied it from a previous copy, which was copied from a previous copy, and so on forever. And Leibniz says, look, we still want to know, why were there ever any books in the first place?
Yeah.
Why were they written like this? Why are they full of valid proofs and not invalid ones? Why is it a math book and not a novel? Why, there's so many other ways this could have been.
Yeah.
And the fact that each one's copied from a preceding one doesn't answer any of those questions.
Yeah.
Leibniz has a deterministic view of the universe, so he thinks you can think of kind of the universe just like that. Each state at each time is copied from the previous state. You can just read it off if you're good enough at physics or whatever.
Yeah.
Leibniz thinks. But that doesn't explain why the whole sequence is as it is, because there's so many other ways it could be.
Yeah. That's so good. I love. I'm glad you brought up your past as a historian of philosophy, because it comes through in your papers where you'll just drop in like these nuggets from the history of philosophy, and I love that. I sometimes people sometimes I get crap for that because I add in too much in my philosophy papers. I'm like, dude, just give me the argument. I don't want to hear. But I love when you're adding this extra. Like it enriches it. And you could probably just be, well, as we all know, Leibniz says. But then you throw in like a nice chunk from Leibniz or something, and I really appreciate that. So I love the way
Yeah.
you write. I want to move on to capital H history.
Yeah.
You describe it as this complex event that needs explanation. Um, I can't remember if you argued for that or not, or if you just said like, look, it needs an explanation. Like is it obvious? Is it like a postulate? Is this argument for someone who does think that the capital H history needs it, or do we need to motivate that?
Yeah. What I mean by history with capital H is the complete sequence of causes and effects, past,
Yeah.
present, and future.
Hmm.
So I'm looking at this from an eternalist perspective. We're looking at kind of a total timeline, past,
Yeah.
present, and future, and we're looking at all the instances of cause and effect that happen along the way. Now, one thing about that is that it's pretty clear that it's contingent, and you can make some arguments from physics that support that. It's
Yeah.
also a highly intuitive premise. You can make arguments from kind of some practical, practical stuff about, like, this desk that my computer is sitting on could have been an inch to the left, surely. Right.
Yeah.
Leibniz's example is it's hard to believe that it's a necessary truth that Spinoza died in The Hague,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Like, he could have hung out in Amsterdam instead or whatever.
Right.
And so there are all these kind of reasons to suppose that that things could have been otherwise, including these sorts of events in history. And in general, what's contingent needs an explanation.
Hmm.
So in that paper, I think I spend at least as much time arguing that that history exists as that history needs an explanation, right?
Yeah.
So, but generally, we believe in complex events. We don't just believe in particle interactions or something.
Yeah.
We also believe in weddings and wars and so on.
Hmm.
And so in this case, we're talking about kind of a bunch of connected interactions, causal interactions, in kind of the total timeline of the universe.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by history.
Okay. So when this got this capital H history, and it's the sum of all the events, or the totality of them. So whether it's, the past is infinite or finite, whatever, just stipulate like this is everything. We're talking about the whole thing. Um, if someone holds to a particular view of PSR, principle of sufficient reason, and says like, well, every fact that stands in need of an explanation has one, but the great total fact doesn't stand in need of explanation because it's the total. Maybe it's a category error or something like that. What do you make of someone using a PSR like that or something?
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons I talk about events and not facts.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right.
And also not objects.
Yeah.
So any kind of version of the cosmological argument, right, that's saying we can prove the existence of God, or argue for the existence of God from the fact that there's anything at all,
Mhm.
usually it uses some kind of big totality, a sufficiently comprehensive entity, it's sometimes said in the right. So you need
Yeah.
something that is kind of inclusive enough that nothing natural could explain it. It's going to
Yeah.
kind of this totality. And so some people talk about the universe as a whole, but there's some question about whether the universe as a whole is really a thing.
Yeah.
Right. Because not, so I don't think that any random collection of parts go to make up an object. I
Okay.
don't think there's an object made out of my left shoe in the Eiffel Tower.
Oh, we got
Right.
restricted composition here then. Okay.
Right. So once
Yeah.
you've got restricted composition, there's no guarantee that the universe exists
Yeah.
as one object that would have one
Right.
explanation.
Okay.
And I'm also I'm not too deep into this to kind of be able to give the whole details of it, but I'm suspicious of infinitely conjunctive facts and propositions,
Okay.
because infinitary logic has a bunch of weird properties. So if you
Yeah.
allow in symbolic logic, if you allow infinitely long sentences, weird things start happening and your logic doesn't behave like what you might have learned in an introductory symbolic logic class.
Yeah.
And so that makes me think, I don't want to, I'm kind of suspicious of that kind of stuff. I don't want to rely on it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But when we have when we think about the composition rules for events, and when we think little events make up a big event, I kind of think, well, if we've got this continuous causal chain going out, then we're pretty safe.
Yeah.
Right? So if we've got kind of everything that followed on from the Big Bang, whatever, that's all kind of causally connected back to it, it seems pretty safe to say that there's a big event like that.
Okay.
Things might be trickier. Maybe I'll get into some problems about the details of physics too, because maybe if inflationary cosmology is right or something, then maybe not everything's connected causally that way. So
yeah, well, I was thinking, does this commit us to like four dimensionalism or like a block universe or B theory of time to be able to? Do we need to view the whole event at once, or does it need to be like this big thing like that, or can the atheist likewise?
So it's probably like everything else where the A theory makes everything unnecessarily complicated for no good reason, but it might still work.
Okay.
So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about how atheists or presentists might make things work, because I just like all the time it's like everything gets so complicated and messy, and I just don't see why they're playing that game.
Okay.
But a lot of people in philosophy of religion, especially a lot of theists, are really committed to those views.
Yeah, I know it.
And I have to say, I've just never understood why. And I have to constantly be reminded to tell people that I'm assuming B theory and eternalism.
Yeah.
Because this has happened with this paper, actually.
Oh, okay.
They often misunderstand me, because that assumption for me is so deep that I forget to state it.
Yeah.
And
that's funny.
And I often don't think about what happens if you reject it until somebody raises that as an objection.
I've noticed that too, because I talk a lot with philosophers of religion, and it's like this live debate, live option. And if you go other places, maybe even like philosophy of time type stuff, if someone's really deep into philosophy of time, then they might be like, oh yeah, sure, my neighbor, is a moving spotlight or something. But usually it's like, well, wait, why wouldn't we go in for four dimensionalism? What are you talking about? A theory? Where are we?
It's all fine. I mean, it's so much simpler in terms of making sense of relativity, and it's so much simpler in terms of making sense of an atemporal God, and it's so much simpler in terms of just like putting things into symbolic logic. And it just the A theory and presentism, it just creates a bunch of unnecessary mess, and I don't understand what's going on with it and why people want it.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so we got some capital H history. I'm glad that you made that. I'm glad that you made the distinction between facts and events. So it's the whole event, and it needs explanation. But the explanation for history, it can't be causal, because history is the sum total of all the causal events. So you'd be like putting a causal event outside of what's supposed to be the whole museum of causal events.
Right.
So then you go in for foundational grounding, which in the paper, and we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but it's synonymous. It's a better translation of primary causation. Like, can you explain your reasoning there, or how foundational grounding relates to primary causation?
So classical theists in the medieval tradition, they talk about God as the first cause, as it were. And in the tradition following on from Thomas Aquinas, who uses this term first cause, in Latin prima causa, right? In the tradition following on from there, it's often called primary causation. These classical theists, even before Aquinas, people like Ibn Sina, they seem to be committed to the claim that God can't be the same kind of cause that a billiard ball is.
Yeah.
Because they're committed to kind of a general view that none of our words can apply to God in exactly the same sense that they apply to created things, because of how God's wholly other.
Got to be analogical, not univocal, and definitely not equivocal. Yeah.
Right. So some of them might even think, like Maimonides might think it's just straight up equivocal.
Whoa, okay.
Maimonides is pretty radical on apophaticism. So if you're saying anything positive about God, you're probably not saying something true. And this might be the same in like Pseudo Dionysius.
Sure.
So Aquinas is kind of thinking these folks don't do enough to preserve kind of ordinary religious talk of the sort you'd find in the Bible or whatever.
Yeah.
And so he'd have kind of a disagreement. He has disagreements with Maimonides and Pseudo-Dionysius. He doesn't always like to admit that he disagrees with people, right? He likes to kind of interpret them in a friendly way so that,
That's right.
so that it seems like everybody's all happy and agreeing.
Right.
But one way or another, they're all going to agree that God doesn't cause things the same way a billiard ball causes things.
Yeah.
And so they call this primary causation, and it's different than secondary causation, which primary causation is God's kind of creating and sustaining the universe, and secondary causation is the causal relations that happen inside the universe.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, the word aitia in Greek and the word causa in Latin that we get in this kind of classical tradition, these words mean basically any answer to a why question. There's a classic paper I cite by a guy called Hokut called Aristotle's Four Becauses. Right?
That's good.
Because the point is, we have a narrow conception of cause today that's shaped by the role of causation in science.
Yeah. And it's like just efficient, right? It's like just hammer that efficient, maybe even like
just secondary efficient causation, right? That's what we mean by cause, I think.
Okay.
And I've got no interest in trying to force the English word cause to do more work than that. I think that causes more confusion than it's worth.
Sure.
And I wouldn't want my use of the word cause to cause confusion.
I know. I was just gonna say, yeah, it causes it. Yeah.
So what I think is, well, we need some other kind of explanation, right? And there are other kinds of explanation that aren't causal. And so what kind of explanation is going to do this kind of work of explaining the totality of causation? And that's where I reach for grounding.
Yeah.
Which is a hot topic in contemporary metaphysics, has been for the past maybe 15 years or so. And people have a lot of different views about grounding. Some philosophers reject it entirely. But I do just want to say this isn't like a special pleading for theism thing. This is a concept that's widely used by atheistic metaphysicians.
Yeah.
Even though not all atheistic metaphysicians like it.
Sure.
Philosophers never agree on anything, right?
No. But I caught in your paper you cited how this was more disagreeable, is more hotly debated, but today it's more commonplace. It's like, and I've had Jonathan Schaffer on to talk about this a little bit because he was kind of at the beginning of that. I think just grounding is okay. We can talk about grounding, and it's fun to like poke fun. I love poking fun at it too, and how everyone talks about grounding now, and we don't talk about supervenience anymore. But but good luck not using it. It's just hard. It's a great tool. It's a great tool to use.
Yeah. Well, and the big thing that I go into some detail about in the book and trying to explain why, and this detail isn't so much in the paper, and trying to explain why kind of everybody needs the concept of grounding, is that some previous folks back to say the logical positivist, back to Carnap and friends, they're thinking that all of science and really all of human knowledge is at the end of the day just physics, right? And it'd just be too long and complicated to talk about quarks all the time. So we come up with these abbreviations and shorthands and we'd say things like table, but this is really abbreviating some complex thing about quarks.
Yeah.
And so this is often called reductionism, right? Or the translation view of reduction, where we're thinking that we can just translate chemistry into physics and translate biology into chemistry and so on.
Yeah.
There's actually no examples of that kind of reduction in science. No philosopher who believes in reductionism ever found any. The most commonly cited example is the reduction of thermodynamics to statistical mechanics. But it turns out there isn't actually a kind of fully successful translation of, say, Boyle's gas laws or the second law of thermodynamics, where you would say, oh, it's just a shorthand for this statement about the motion of particles.
Right.
That doesn't actually work. And so if you read kind of specialist philosophy of physics papers on this, they're talking about this very complex relation. And so it's pretty well understood, right? The relationship between statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. It's well understood. But it's not this like straightforward translation thing. There's another classic paper by Philip Kitcher on how we explain the concept of a gene in terms of DNA. So how you get from like Mendelian genetics to biochemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And the really classic paper on this is from the 70s by Jerry Fodor called Special Sciences or the Disunity of Science as a Working Hypothesis.
Yeah.
That, so basically this kind of translation view doesn't work.
Yeah.
The supervenience view, it turns out, it doesn't work unless you add extra clauses to the traditional definition of supervenience that make it look more like grounding.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what we need is, and what we're really talking about with grounding is how we get from more fundamental things to less fundamental things, right? How the more fundamental things explain the less fundamental things.
Yeah.
Right. So somehow those quarks and electrons explain my desk. And those kinds of things are, or quantum fields explain my desk, if you like. Those kinds of things are, that's the kind of relation that we're talking about with grounding.
Yeah. And those aren't causes. Well, they don't have to be causes in the strict, secondary, efficient causal sense. But though they're explanations, and so you're broadening out this idea of causation, primary causation. That's why foundational grounding is a better word than primary causation.
Right. And so God, the primary causation that the classical theists talk about already has at least one of the key features of grounding, or two of the key features of grounding. Yeah. One is it's a relation between a more fundamental thing and less fundamental things, right? Because God is kind of the ultimate, most fundamental thing in the classical theistic picture. And the second way is just that it is a form of metaphysical explanation that is not the same as the kind of explanation, as the kind of causal explanations, efficient causal explanations that would occur in science.
Yeah.
And yet it's like a making it the case relation, right? It's God's creative activity makes it the case that that the universe exists, however exactly you're understanding the universe.
Yeah, I love that. I caught that in the paper. So then in your model, you have these three stages. God performs an act of the will. This act of the will constitutes big H history, capital H history. And 3, history is the narrative ground of particular created things like you and me, which the last one is, so they're all good, but the last one really is getting to me. So God performs the act of a will, and you give this example. You say each of these have, non-theological examples. And the first one, God performs an act of the will, an example would be an agent and her action. So just we call this agent causation, right? And so we're getting back to is that right or no?
Well, I'm not so sure.
Okay.
So I think somehow you need to think of an action that's sustained over time, right? Like a dance.
Oh yeah, you gave that example.
And if you're thinking about something like a dance, it's not just, so some agent causation pictures, typically they're like thinking the agent, whatever the agent turns out to be on these agent causal pictures, right? Some kind of substance. Causes some first event that's like an act of will or something, or maybe an event in the brain, and then it kind of sets in motion this causal sequence that leads to my waving my arm around or whatever.
Okay.
Right? Not thinking about that relation here, right? Thinking about the way the agent, who's the dancer, holds the dance in being. Right? The dance continues to exist as long as the dancer continues performing the motions.
Yeah.
And so this kind of the activity or the event of the dance is as it were sustained in being by the agent.
Okay. Okay, so when it comes to God performing an act of the will as the foundational ground of capital H history, does that mean it's a continuous? God has to continually, perform this act of the will in order for capital H history to exist?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of God as atemporal, right? And that the theoretic block as depending on God's atemporal act. But yeah, it's the act kind of continuously sustains history and being over the whole course of history, right? It doesn't just kick things off at the beginning.
Yeah, that's good.
The whole course of history through all of time is grounded in the act.
And I mean, as a Christian, like that sounds great because it's like, well, we want that. God sustains, it's part of his providential work.
Yeah, and I think this grounding stuff. I think especially theistic philosophers. I think they were talking about grounding and counterpossible conditionals, hyperintentionality, to use all the fancy words.
Yep.
All this stuff that analytic philosophers used to say they rejected. The theist analytic philosophers used to say they rejected it too, right? Or at least not appeal to it explicitly.
Uh-huh.
But I think if you read this stuff from like the 70s and 80s, I think it's pretty clear they've been using it all along. Some of the atheist metaphysicians have too, but especially the theists, it was never really possible to formulate the view without this stuff.
That's good.
So sustaining, right? Let's talk about God sustaining the world and being.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a temporal relation like causation, where the cause comes before the effect, right?
Yeah.
It's a relation that's synchronic, as philosophers say, that kind of happens all at once, or they're simultaneous.
Yeah.
And so it's a like simultaneous, continuous dependence relation. And and what's happened is that it just turns out that classical theism or traditional theism is not the only metaphysical view that needs that kind of relation in order to work. It turns out a lot of metaphysical views do need that sort of thing in them, and that's how I'm thinking about the role of grounding here.
Okay, that's helpful. So we got God performs this act of the will. Then the act of the will constitutes history, and you use the example of a statue and its material, which should be familiar to a lot of people that study metaphysics, right? The act of the will. Can you help us think through the act of the will constitutes history? What's that word constituting? What's the word constitute? What is that doing here? How's that helping us?
Yeah, so I always say that grounding is the relation or family of relations whereby more fundamental things give rise to less fundamental things.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big debate about what's sometimes called big G versus small g grounding.
Okay.
Which is the question of whether, like Jonathan Schaffer, who you mentioned, and Kip Fine, they're big G grounding theorists.
Yeah.
They think there's this one grounding relation, and we can kind of explain everything in terms of this relation. Then there are other people like Jessica Wilson, say, who think, we do need these sorts of ontological dependence relations, but we can't just say that, but they're just not all the same, right? There are all these different ontological dependence relations. And I'm trying to be neutral on that question.
Yeah.
But because I'm trying to be neutral on that question, I need to say, what kind of relation is this out of all, what kind of ontological dependence relation is this? And what are kind of the best non-theological models to understand it by?
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm think about the statue and clay case. So the statue is not numerically identical with the clay in the sense that would be required by Leibniz's law.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you smash it, the clay will still exist and the statue won't.
Right.
And so they have different properties, so they're not numerically identical.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow the statue is nothing over and above the clay. If you kind of put it on a scale, you only count its weight once.
Yep.
Right. There's no extra matter that's in the statue that's not in the clay, and so on and so forth. It's so it's somehow not numerically identical, but in some sense the same or nothing over and above. And we can get examples with actions, like Jones's raising her hand constitutes her voting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you've got kind of a lower level description of the action and a higher level description of the action, and kind of in these total circumstances, in the context or whatever, raising the hand is the way to vote.
Yeah.
And so on. And so history, being an event, we might want a kind of action or event-like thing to constitute it. And so I'm thinking kind of in this way, as it were, God's performing the action constitutes history. History is nothing over and above God's creative activity.
Yeah.
And so the story of the universe, or in some sense, is nothing over and above God's creative activity.
Yeah. Okay. That That's really helpful. Now I'm seeing it. So I mean, 3 follows naturally from that. History is the narrative ground of particular creative things like you and me, because we exist in history. And so history, I mean, it's built up, right? Like we're
Right.
grounded in history. History is constituted by God's act of will, and God performs the act of will as an agent does their action.
Right.
Um, so this is awesome. You get to this point where you say fictional objects are to fictional narratives in an analogous case or a similar way. I don't know if you even say analogous, but in a similar way that we are to God. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering, does this like commit us to ontological pluralism or something? Are there different ways of existing?
So I don't think I don't talk about different ways of existing. So for
Yeah.
me, this some people might think this is a notational variant, and that's fine with me.
Hmm.
But there are reasons why I like to talk this way. So I think the existential quantifier expresses existence. Okay, so if there exists an X such that X is human, that's just how you say humans exist, right?
Yeah.
And we can quantify over everything, including fictional characters.
Uh-huh.
Batman exists, sure, fine,
Okay, that's
okay.
cool.
Yeah, but the thing is, Batman isn't real, right?
Yeah.
And even though he exists, and real is the word in plain language that we use to kind of distinguish, right? It's the opposite of fictional.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also the opposite of imaginary, and so on.
Yeah.
You say, well, Sherlock Holmes exists, but he's not a real detective; he's a fictional detective,
Yeah.
right? And you kind of need to talk about this way if you're going to say sentence. One of the example sentences I give in the book, going back to our science fiction, is that there are several varieties of Star Trek aliens, right? Right, there are many different kinds of aliens in Star Trek. Well,
Yeah.
there are. That's an existence claim, right? And so we do think that fictional characters exist, but they're not real.
Yeah.
And so rather than talk about different kinds of existence or different ways of existing, I talk about different degrees or levels of reality.
Yeah.
And those are going to track. This is a pretty common view among grounding theorists. It's not universal,
Okay.
but those degrees of reality or degrees of fundamentality, if you prefer, they're going to track these grounding relations, right? Because the grounding is an interlevel relation, a relation between more real and less real things.
Yeah. And the more fundamental, the more real an object is, and fundamentality comes in degrees.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. That's good. So God would be on this case. God would be the most real. He's the most
Right.
fundamental. We
Right.
are real, but we're less real than God because we're less fundamental. Sherlock Holmes is even less real than us, and the way that Sherlock Holmes relates to Arthur Conan Doyle is a similar way that Arthur Conan Doyle relates to God, his author or creator.
Yeah, that's the idea.
I love that, man. That's so good. Um, Okay, so with God performing this act of the will, which is like the base level, people will say, well, then are my actions like overdetermined, or do we just put God on the hook for all the evil that I've done in my life? What do you make of that?
Right. So I'm going to distinguish kind of two different problems here.
Yeah.
The first problem is the author of sin problem.
Hmm.
And the second problem is the kind of free will and theological determinism problem.
Yep.
Now, people don't always distinguish those, but I think the authorial analogy shows clearly that they come apart.
Yeah.
So the author of sin problem is the problem that God is really the one who does all the sinning because I'm not like a real agent responsible for my actions. The problem with theological determinism is like saying if God decrees all of my specific actions, then what are we going to say about free will? How are we going to explain evil in the world, et cetera, et cetera? Right. So I think those clearly come apart, and this is why Shakespeare didn't kill Duncan. Macbeth did that.
Let's go. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Like
that's right.
so the author of sin problem is not happening here. But Shakespeare decided that Macbeth was going to kill Duncan.
Yeah.
You see.
Yeah.
And this raises our kind of other problem about what this means about whether Macbeth can have free will in whatever sense we care about,
Yeah.
and also our problem about, why would God create a history that goes like this if
Yeah.
God has the kind of total control that you might think an author would have over their creation.
Yeah.
Now, that's this is so this is maybe the more serious problem, right? Is this problem about total control? Let me just float something I'm working on right now.
Awesome.
I'm writing more about this, and kind of shout out. This is based on work by some other philosophers who are doing similar things about divine creation.
Yeah.
Let me mention Sam Liebens, Tien-Chun Lo, and Megan Page.
Okay.
As people I'm drawing on in developing this idea.
Awesome.
If you look at first-person accounts by authors, it doesn't always seem like they have the kind of total control that's assumed here. That is, as it were, once the character is created, the character seems to the author, as it were, to make certain demands, or the story makes certain demands, that it has to be continued in a certain way. And the author could kind of force the story down an alternative path, but this would somehow violate the integrity of the artwork or the integrity of the character. And that seems like what a lot of theological libertarians want to say about God and creatures.
Yeah.
That, of course, God could force us to do anything, but if God engages in that kind of force, it violates our integrity that makes us no longer free.
Yeah.
And I cite comments by science fiction authors Ursula Le Guin and N.K. Jemisin to support this claim. But it's also something that's been explored a bit by Sam Liebens in his fantastic book, The Principles of Judaism.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily committed to that view. I think we might be able to kind of salvage theological determinism. I'm not sure.
Nice.
A lot of people think it's like really obvious that theological determinism is a non-starter.
Yeah. Oh, so I'm a theological determinist myself. I worked on my master's thesis, which is like ridiculous to bring that up in this conversation, but was working on the Authorial Analogy, Kevin Van Hooser, trying to defend it against the author of Sin problem and epistemological self-defeat, that like you couldn't believe that. And so I love it. So please go ahead and salvage it, man. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So I mean, so I think theological determinism might be okay, but necessitarianism is definitely not.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's why I'm working on this kind of stuff, the question about how, going back to the contingency argument, right? Because exactly what theism is supposed to be able to explain is why there is contingency, why the world is this way when it didn't have to be this way. There's this fear that the theist is going to collapse back into necessitarianism because God has to create the best of all possible worlds or something.
Yeah, like a modal collapse. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the problem I'm actually worried about.
Okay.
And kind of if you end up not having theological determinism, then of course human free will becomes a source of contingency.
Yeah.
And so I'm more interested in the like free will stuff and whether authors have total control and that kind of thing from the perspective of trying to see how much contingency does this theistic metaphysics actually give us.
Yeah. So I really like that because a lot of the problems in philosophy of religion, they trace right back over. So I'm thinking the authorial analogy in like theological terms, it inherits a lot of the philosophical problems from philosophy of religion or philosophical theology, like if like greatest possible worlds. If you have a greatest possible story, did God have to tell that story? Okay, now we have modal collapse even in the authorial analogy. Okay, so it has to be a good story. Well, why would he pick this good story instead of this other good story? And so that the same conversation pops back up. I love it. It's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, so exactly the thing that's supposed to happen here, and this is all over Leibniz, for instance, exactly the thing that a being who makes a free and rational choice is supposed to get us in the kind of classical theistic world picture given by the argument from contingency, right? Is it supposed to give us something that's neither arbitrary nor necessary?
Yeah.
Right. So it's somehow fully explained without necessitating. And I kind of say in the debate book, I kind of admit it, because I'm not much of a debater, because I'm more interested in kind of dwelling on and exploring the problems and puzzles of my view rather than scoring points.
Yeah.
So so not being much of a debater, I kind of point to, this is the trickiest part for me, is this divine freedom and contingency stuff. Here's why I think that we can kind of get what we want here, where it's kind of neither arbitrary nor necessary. But this is the place where more work needs to be done to work out the details, and that's stuff that I'm working on now.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to see some more of that. I like the note about the character, and like once you've made him or her, they have certain demands of you. Like if you made Samwise Gamgee into like a rapist without explaining some kind of psychological break or something, like that's, you can't do that. Tolkien could not have done, like he can't do that without destroying his character. And if God's a good author, like he couldn't do that either. But it's not because there's some limitation on God, but because God has created a character this way, or set his own limitations on saying, this is this is my idea of Samwise Gamgee. And then you have to go into God's ideas and his relationship to the ideas.
Yeah. And so the question here is, do we have the view that all of God's ideas of all the possible creatures are just like the space of metaphysical possibility, right?
Yeah.
In which case you wouldn't get like what the Molinist thinks, that there's more than one action that's possible for this character, and yet one of them is the one the character would do.
Right.
That's the right. But if you have something more like, if you think that as God is kind of thinking up these characters, there's a sort of, indeterministic grounding, I would say.
Okay.
Where the kind of essence or idea of the character demands that it be developed in a certain sort of way on pain of violating its integrity. But those demands themselves are not necessitated by the character's essence.
Yeah. What would they be?
Creative process could have gone otherwise.
Yeah. Well, so I guess I'm thinking people who would push back on Molinists and say, with the grounding objection, and they say, well, so then what's grounding those? Like, why must this character be this way in this situation?
Yeah, so there's
not must, right? Because you don't want to go with deterministic.
Right. So a lot of what I'm working on now is this this notion of indeterministic grounding.
Okay.
And the idea that grounds may not necessitate, can fully explain without necessitating.
Okay.
And so I think, like Alex Pearce has written about this in his great book on the principle of sufficient reason, that kind of when you're thinking about an indeterministic outcome, like measuring the electron spin up rather than spin down, you should think like the prior state, right, fully caused and therefore fully explained the spin up measurement. Even though exactly the same state could have fully caused and therefore fully explained the spin down measurement. And if you think that's the right way to think about causal explanation, then you can do, as it were, the same thing with grounding explanation. And so then what you need to do is find something in the essence, like some features of the character, that render intelligible this decision rather than that decision.
Yeah.
And this all gets into the same kind of moves that get made in trying to make the divine freedom stuff work, right? Where God has, as it were, competing motives. One of them explains why God creates this world, and it at the same time explains why the other motive wasn't effective.
Yeah.
Right. So you think something like God kind of values complexity and beauty, and that's why God created this world rather than no world at all. Right? Or this world and not no world at all. I maybe shouldn't say rather than.
Yeah.
But in the possible world where God creates nothing at all, God values the absence of evil, ultimate simplicity, right? The absence of anything imperfect. And God necessarily values all of those things, right?
Yeah.
But not all of those values can be actualized at once. And so the values as it were, that are motivating the actual world that God creates, those explain why this world is actual, and they explain why other worlds aren't actual. This is drawing on Alex Pearce, his paper Divine Creative Freedom.
So I guess yeah, we don't have to. We could get super bogged down here, but just like, could you go one step further and just say, well, we have the explanation. We would have the same explanation if, well, we wouldn't, but if there was the world where God didn't create, if that was the one that He actualized, you and I wouldn't be here talking about this, but there would still, in principle, be an explanation for why He chose that one instead of the other.
Yeah.
With including us. So there is a reason underneath that, or is it like indeterministic that he just created this one and not that one?
Yeah. So the move I make that I'm getting from Pearce is that I deny that there are such things as contrastive facts.
Okay.
So when you say P rather than Q, you're not really saying anything more than P and not Q.
Okay.
There's some kind of pragmatic thing where you're like expressing, I want this type of explanation and not some other kind.
Yep.
Right. But really the like objective fact is P and not Q.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always explain P and not Q by explaining why P and explaining why not Q in general. And so the fact that God values the existence of rational beings besides God's self, for instance, partly explains why God created this world and partly explains why God didn't refrain from creating.
Okay.
Right? But it's not.
It doesn't necessitate that He did create this one, of course.
Right, it doesn't necessitate. And so like the exact same facts could have explained something else.
Yeah.
That is something else could have happened and been fully explained given the same facts. Which facts explain what would have been different in that case?
Yeah. Okay. This is tough stuff. This is good. I think you're right to point to that, to say like this is an area that needs to be developed. I'm glad that you're working at too. That you're not just going, okay, someone else do it. I'm glad that you're sticking to it. When it comes to God, so God made it the case, because we're not using this like strong causal language, efficient causal language. God made it the case. We went pretty quick over like the sin and evil. Like I'd love to use Tolkien instead of Macbeth and stuff if we could, because it just helps me, but my listeners too, hopefully.
Yeah.
I love this because like Tolkien, why did Smeagol become Gollum? Well, because he had this evil desire to take the ring. The ring was partially causal, probably, and his cousin Deagle had the ring, and so there's this within the story, intra-narratively, he has the explanation. There's reasons for it, and then extra-narratively, Tolkien wrote that Smeagol would turn into Deagle, or would turn into Gollum. But it would be so crazy to try and arrest Tolkien and say, like, you evil murderer, how dare you do that? Because there are different levels of explanation, right?
Yeah. So I think so. That's right. That kind of Tolkien doesn't perform any of the actions that Gollum performs, right? He's responsible for Gollum performing those actions in this like authorial responsibility sense.
Yeah.
Now, some Thomists want to say, because of this difference of level and God as author, that means God's not a moral agent. God has no moral obligations to us. And so there is no problem of evil. I really do not like this line at all.
Yeah.
Because I think, for one thing, I think Christians have an independent commitment to the claim that God kind of wants the good for us. And actually, Aquinas uses that claim in his explanation of why God creates anything at all.
Yeah.
Right? This claim that God, because goodness is diffusive of itself, it's a slogan for Plato, right? That like God wants the goodness of other things.
Yeah.
But there's this philosophical commitment to it, even within Aquinas. There's also a kind of theological commitment for Christians to divine benevolence, or to even divine love. And I just think there's good reason to suppose that that Tolkien doesn't love Gollum, right? Yeah. Like, or doesn't want what's best for Gollum, at least prima facie, right?
Yeah.
In the and so you can tell some kind of story, maybe, but now we're getting back to actually having to respond to the problem of evil, right? So they're like, is a problem about if Tolkien loves Gollum and wants what's best for him, why does the story go this way for Gollum?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
That's a good question, right?
well, I think the authorial analogy opens up solutions within within the authorial analogy where you say, well, look, the plot would be a worse plot if he
Mm-hmm.
didn't do that, and so there's a greater good, and even though Tolkien does love uh, Smeagol, like it's a better story to be told if he turns in. Well, that's not really good for Golem. Like, no, it's not. But depends on what kind of story you want to tell, and if you're the author, you have the right. But then you get into like, well, aren't there moral obligations to the character? Yes, there are. But he still had Smeagol still had his reasons, and so you could go in for like a reasons responsiveness for free will or something like that. Like, he still had guidance control. He still had reasons
Yeah.
responsive. No one messed with it. With no one. If it was a what do they call it? Deus ex machina. Like, if
Right.
it didn't fit within the plot, then we could go, look, Tolkien's a bad character. Smeagol didn't want to do this, and he forced him to do it. But as
Right.
long as there's consistency within the story, I don't know. It's tricky.
Yeah. So I think that the authorial analogy opens up kind of productive ways of looking at the problem.
Yeah.
I think this is kind of all that anything ever does with the problem of evil is
Sure.
that kind of there's a lot of kind of bits and pieces, different approaches we can take, like
Mhm.
Marilyn Adams' work on horrendous evils,
Mhm.
or the skeptical theism stuff,
Yeah.
or soul making. Like all of these things, they're as it were productive partial perspectives to
Yeah.
take that kind of help us fit some pieces together to work our way around the puzzle.
Yeah.
But they don't kind of solve the puzzle or make it disappear.
No, I don't think that. Yeah, I think you're
Yeah.
right. Well, okay, so I'll commend the authorial analogy more. I think it can bring all those together in a cohesive story. Not to solve, again, I'm with you on that. But skeptical theism makes sense in the authorial analogy because well, if you take C.S. Lewis, now we're jumping around characters, but C.S. Lewis wrote himself into The Great Divorce. He's a character within the story, like the main character, and yet he's still the author upholding the whole story.
Yeah.
And so he's got this outsideness. He can That's a continental word that Van Hooser uses, but he's a character inside the story interacting with his characters. He can persuade them of things and not violate their volition, but he's also the character, the author upholding the story, and he can see the plot development. So you can use soul building as well to say, like, why is there hiddenness? Why is the author hidden from the characters? Well, for their own good, because he's developing their character. All sorts of stuff. I
Yeah.
love the authorial analogy. You can bring him in.
Sam Liebens has this great paper, Hasidic Idealism,
Okay.
it's in a collection of essays on idealism that I edited with Ty Goldschmidt a few years
Oh
ago.
yeah, for sure.
But yeah, Hasidic Idealism, Kurt Vonnegut and the Creator of the Universe.
Mm.
And it's about the Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, where Vonnegut shows up and talks to Kilgore Trout, who, by the way, is a parody of Theodore Sturgeon. It's a fish joke.
Oh, no way.
Vonnegut shows up in the story and talks to Kilgore Trout and explains to Kilgore Trout, "I created you." Right. So you've got Vonnegut inside the story talking about Vonnegut, the author, outside the story.
Yes.
And Liebens thinks that God's appearance. So Liebens is a rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks that God's appearances in kind of the historical narrative of the Hebrew Bible and in kind of the history of the people of Israel is understood something like this. And we have to distinguish God, the character in the story, from God outside the story.
Oh, man, I love
God
that.
writing God's self into the story like Vonnegut.
Yeah.
And kind of the, trying to look at some of the logical issues that this poses and the ways that this should affect how we understand the various biblical statements about God, most of which are about kind of God, the character in history.
Yeah.
Rather than the kind of unknown God outside.
I'm getting like all flustered. That's so fantastic. And I think that can help us with like Christology and stuff and well, definitely with Old Testament stuff, but does God really care? Does God really change his mind? Well, what are you talking about? The character inside the story? Like, God is a genuine character, but he's still representing the ideas of the author himself. That's who he's meant to be. And so, like, C.S. Lewis didn't change his mind because of a dialogue with a character in his story, as the author sitting in Oxford, but maybe within the story he did right. So I know some people will get really upset by that and say, well, now you're this is somehow process theism. It's not process theism at all. It's a good way of accounting for the biblical text. But yeah, I'm getting all excited. This is awesome. I love this kind of yeah. Okay, so I don't think we don't have enough time here to talk about why like naturalism is precluded by this, but I thought maybe we could just finish with, you make this claim about ontological arguments, and it's usually assumed that like contingency arguments depend on an ontological argument, but you're saying it's actually the opposite. Ontological arguments depend on contingency, or at least one does on this one. Do you have that fresh in your mind? Can you help us with that?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so my view is that, which I think, again, I think that Thomas Aquinas thinks something like this.
Okay.
I'm not very much. I don't say the same kind of things these neo-Thomists do, but I think I'm pretty close actually to the Thomistic view. It's just that I have an idiosyncratic way of translating it into contemporary metaphysics, right?
Yeah, that's always a dangerous thing, talking about Aquinas and what did Aquinas really believe? Because
Right.
you'll have a whole fight, but I like the translating it. Yeah.
Yeah. So right, translating doesn't necessarily mean saying what Aquinas said, right? Because we're putting it in a new framework and a new set of concepts and so on. But anyway, so the cosmological argument gives reason to suppose that a necessary being exists. And then we have to understand what would a being have to be like in order to be necessary in the way required. And you can go all the way back to Ibn Sina on this. His kind of most famous and distinctive philosophical move is his claim that in God there's no distinction between essence and existence. Now, you don't have to go all the way as strong as Ibn Sina, but if you say God's essence must somehow include existence, that's what it would mean for a being to be necessary, right? Is for the being's essence to include existence. Now, if there is a being whose essence includes existence, then there is a sound ontological argument.
Yeah.
And so the first premise would be a statement of God's essence, a real definition of God. And then you would be able to prove God's existence from that. But but we don't know God's real definition.
Yeah, God could prove God's existence, but yeah,
exactly. I like to say there's a sound ontological argument, but God only knows how it goes. Right, because you would need to kind of grasp the divine essence to be able to give a real definition of God, not a nominal definition, to say what God really is or what it is to be God, which is something that is impossible for us. And this, I take it, is what Aquinas says is wrong with Anselm's reasoning, is that Anselm supposes that he's got a kind of grasp of the divine nature, which is impossible for humans.
Yeah.
And so if this is right, then you can't use the ontological argument to prove the existence of God. Right?
We can't. Yeah.
We can't. We cannot use the ontological argument to prove the existence of God. But if we've already accepted the existence of God on the basis of a cosmological argument, or if we've already accepted that there's a sound cosmological argument, we have good reason to believe there's also a sound ontological argument. And this can help us to, as it were, explain why God exists, right? God exists by God's essence. And so we have kind of the structure of explanation that you need. Something that's interesting here. So a lot of my kind of approach to grounding in the principle of sufficient reason, another philosopher I haven't mentioned yet, who I draw heavily on, is Shamik Dasgupta.
Yeah.
And especially I like this paper of his, Metaphysical Rationalism. And Dasgupta says that his position is consistent with naturalism, right? But he also says, look, in order to get this kind of principle of sufficient reason, say that everything that's apt for grounding is grounded, ultimately you're going to have to bottom out in a thing or things whose essence includes existence. So he's kind of saying the same thing, that is, a maximally satisfying explanatory structure has to go a certain way. It has to bottom out in a being whose essence includes existence, or a being who exists by essence, exists essentially. And kind of if we can make sense of that notion, then again, the question is kind of what's the best, most satisfying explanatory theory out of all the theories that have that structure? What's the best candidate for an essentially existing being? And I would note that in the paper, I don't argue that my model is the best model for an explanation of history for an essentially existing being. I construct this model just to show that it's possible to get this explanatory structure on theism.
Yeah.
And I argue that it's not possible on naturalism.
Yeah.
But there's so many other theistic models and also models that are both not traditionally theistic or not monotheistic and not naturalistic.
Like panpsychism or something.
Yeah, some kind of
Panentheism
or a kind of pluralistic panpsychism that might ground everything in a plurality of minds, or there's or Spinozism. There's kind of so to me, part of the next step, right, would be just I invite other people to develop other models. I want to hear about kind of all the different ways you might undertake this task, because all I did was outline one to show that it is intelligible and it explains the data. I didn't do anything to argue that it's the best.
Yeah. Oh man, this is awesome. I'm so glad that you're still running with this. There's a couple others doing like even like authorial analogy work, like James Anderson's working on that. I'm trying to I like the translating word. I'm trying to translate Kevin Van Hooser's stuff from more continentally type language to analytic philosophy. I love it. I think it's helpful. I want to finish with a question about like your personal walk, I guess. Do you I don't think we use analogy here, but there's this narratival ground. We're living in history, and history is grounded in this manner that we laid out in an authorial analogy type thing. Do you think of yourself as living in like a divine, theodrama or like a story? Like, are you one of God's characters in his story?
I'm working on it.
Okay.
That is one of the other things that I'm really interested in, and this connects up with my historical work. George Berkeley is kind of my main guy. Leibniz has a bigger influence on my philosophy of religion work, but my kind of historical scholarship, Berkeley's been the philosopher I've written most about.
Yeah.
And Berkeley, one of his most influential ideas, this isn't the idea that's most associated with him in intro to philosophy classes, but the idea that like actually caught on, is this idea that infants have to learn to see. That when you first open your eyes, the thing you're seeing doesn't mean anything. It's like flat fields of color or whatever.
Yeah.
And you actually can't see things at a distance until you've learned to kind of reach and grasp and correlate the visible with moving and touching.
Yeah.
And part of what this is kind of opening the door for is that so much of how we perceive the world is learned by experience and by kind of our background and how we think of things. And Berkeley, a connection that not enough people have drawn in Berkeley's works is that, he argues for this, and then he argues for immaterialism, the view that all of our perceptions are directly caused by God and there's no mind-independent material world.
Yeah.
And he gets to the end of the principles. A lot of these early modern philosophers, they have some like devotional material at the end of their philosophical works, and all these secular scholars ignore it.
Yeah.
And he gets to the end of the principles, and he says, it's a premise of the unthinking herd that we cannot see God, right? They say, if only we could see God, we'd all believe.
Yeah.
But these people, he says, are making a mistake, because you see, it's only one small collection of ideas that informs me of another human being, whereas everywhere I look, I should be seeing God. And what he's thinking is that if you can learn to see the world rightly, if you have the right kind of background theory, the right understanding of what the world really is, you would see God everywhere.
Yeah.
You'd regard God as speaking to you through your senses. And you'd think that every action you take in the world is, as it were, a response in a conversation with God.
Yeah.
And he thinks that if you really believed that, it would change your life.
Yeah.
And so he's doing all this like weird abstract philosophy, all this immaterialism, talk about ideas, there's no material substances. And he's coming out at the end at this like, picture of a God-bathed world in a famous phrase from somebody else. I kind of, I think the same thing,
Mhm.
right? But it's very hard to internalize these kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think that one of the other main argument that I discuss in the debate book is an argument from religious experience.
Mm.
And I think that the fact that religious experience is learned and it's produced on purpose by religious practices does not undermine its evidential value,
Okay.
because a lot of our sensory experience and other things are like that.
Yeah.
And so I think when you think about religious practice, it's in large part about trying to learn to see God everywhere.
Yeah. Man, that's good. This was devotional. I really appreciate that. I love that line of reasoning because intuitively, or maybe just initially, or whatever, um, you would a lot of people would think, well, it should be an innate idea because God wouldn't leave
Mm,
us without that innate idea. So if it's
right,
learned, then it's somehow a result of some kind of malformed psychology that you're learning to put on your blinders or something. It's like no, like
right,
if we have to do this with the rest of reality, I'm not putting on my blinders when I'm looking at a book in the distance. Then I'm
right,
actually coming to see. Why not have to come to see God, especially if He is a person, like a personal agent or like a an author. I have to learn how to interact with my spouse. It's taken me a long time. I'm still learning that. So,
right.
that's not innate, but it's not an illusion. I don't think that she's an illusion. Maybe
Yeah. And so if I
sometimes
can
it's
give you one more
please,
reading
please.
recommendation,
Yeah.
Ritualized Faith by Terence Cuneo.
Okay.
This is a book. Terence Cuneo was I think he was raised Dutch Reformed, but he converted to Greek Orthodoxy.
Oh, snap. Okay.
Um, but it's this book is about the idea that the kind of knowledge or the kind of cognitive state that's involved in Christian faith is a kind of know-how for the life with God.
Yeah.
And ritual is a way of learning how to live that life in community.
Yeah.
And so it's not actually about kind of, maybe nobody knows facts about God, and maybe some people don't even believe them who have a kind of faith. Maybe you just can't bring yourself to believe it, and yet you might learn how, as it were, to live that life in community with other believers and with God,
Hmm.
and how to view your life as interaction with God. And this might come through the right kind of ritual practice,
Yeah.
and not through philosophical or theological reflection alone.
W- Um, would you wouldn't you eventually need to have like some kind of propositional, like I do believe that God exists, or
So I don't think you need anything as strong as belief. You need
ah,
something,
okay.
right? So like suppose, I mean, this usually happens in cases that are kind of really emotionally fraught and difficult, where there's a lot at stake.
Uh-huh.
Imagine a house has collapsed and someone you love was buried under the rubble,
Yeah.
and you might be, say, 90% sure that they're dead.
Uh-huh.
But as you're digging out, you call to them and you yell, "Hang on, we're coming," right?
Hmm.
If they're alive, you are really talking to them
Yeah.
and really in relationship with them still
Uh-huh.
in life, right? Even though you actually believe that they cannot hear you,
Yeah.
right? You're doing it anyway because you hope they can,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think states like that of kind of hope or conjecture or just like that sort of thing could be enough for someone to genuinely address God in prayer and in ritual,
Hmm.
and in fact even to have a genuine relationship if it turns out that God does exist.
Yeah, so it's I wonder there's like a internalist externalist kind of like correlation or
Yeah,
analogous things. It depends on whether you're in the good case, whether the person is alive, then you have a relationship. It doesn't have to do with whether your belief is more than 50% or something like that, like the
right.
internalist might say. Okay.
Yeah. So you still have to have some kind of cognitive attitude toward the claim that,
Otherwise you wouldn't act on that. You wouldn't, right? Is that right? You wouldn't
right.
say, "Hold on."
It's got to be, as it were, you're sort of trying to relate to God in these ways,
Yeah.
which would be irrational if you were sure that God didn't exist.
Yeah.
And in order for you to do that when you think the probability is low, to still like invest the time when you got to think the stakes are really high.
Yeah.
So there's some kind of a Pascalian thing going on there.
Right. It's
But
fascinating.
but yeah, if you've got the right kind of like hope or something like that, hope or conjecture or acceptance for the sake of argument, and the stakes are high, that you're going to kind of invest this effort just on the off chance that it works.
Yeah.
Just like trying to talk to that person who you think is almost certainly dead.
Yeah.
Right. If you that I think can be the basis for genuinely succeeding in relating to God.
Yeah, man, that's so fascinating. I think that could be a whole nother podcast. As long as as long as like the reason for your 90% disbelief, or I don't, that's not right, but the credence or whatever being up to 90% that he's not alive, buried underneath. As long as that's not like a moral failing or something, like you've actually put yourself in that position or something. But if it's like a genuine, like, yeah, I've heard good arguments against God's existence, or evil and suffering in my own life has raised that credence. I think, yeah, there's more stuff that could go into it. It's just, that's a really fascinating topic. I think that's like a protheism, antitheism debate as well, and that's cool. This is great. We went all over the place here today. Dr. Pearce, thanks so much for coming on and talking about this paper. Love to do it again. I'd love to talk more about authorial analogy stuff. I'm so glad that you're continuing to do that work. I need to grab that book with you and Api and check that out as well.
Great. Thank you for having me on. This has been fun.
Yeah. Before I let you go though, where can people find more of your works?
Yeah, so my website is kennypearce.net, and you can kind of see all my published work there and an occasionally updated blog. I have a much more frequently updated Twitter feed at Kenneth L. Pearce.
Awesome. Okay, I'll put a link in the description to all that good stuff. Again, man, thanks. This has been huge. Folks, that's going to have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.